Okay, so shall we go ahead and start?
That would be great.
I think we're going to start this morning with Douglas, who is the chair of our Department of Architecture, and he's going to be talking about where we're going with the Global Studio and how some of you might like to participate in that.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you to our speakers today as well. As many of you know, we've been doing the Global Studio now for well over a year. And since we started doing this, we've staged, probably by the end of February, we will have staged over 25 events. And through a combination of live participants and YouTube views, we've reached more than 10,000 people, which is quite remarkable. And the sad part is that our funding for this phase of the Global Studio comes to an end at the end of February. But as many of you know, we're working on a major grant, a partnerships grant with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, to apply for up to $2.5 million, that is Canadian, to be spent over 5 years. And we would be delighted if we could engage and work with the people who are online today in order to take the Global Studio to its next level. We call it Global Studio 2.0. So to this end, we are going to try and have an information session on Thursday. Now, it is Thursday for everybody, whether you're in Canada or Australia, but it is a wide variety of times. Now, I put in the chat the link to the Zoom, but at the same time, it's going to be like 7 a.m. in Pacific Zone, 8 a.m. in the Mountain Zone. It's going to be 10 o'clock in Toronto, and then we're going to send out an invitation. I believe it's going to be like 3 o'clock in Wales, 4 o'clock in Nigeria, 5 o'clock in South Africa and Lesotho, and 11 o'clock at night in Australia. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your ideas for the future of the Global Studio. And if you can join us on Thursday, we would be delighted. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen. And again, thank you, Kristen, for organizing this. And thank you to Veronica for organizing this. I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Thank you.
So again, good morning, everyone. I'm Kristen Kornienko. I'm organized what is the collaboration of the Global Studio. And I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm privileged to look out at a beautiful lake on lands formerly known as the Salish region of Turtle Island, today known as the interior of British Columbia within the political boundaries of Canada. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a fifth-generation white settler, now living and working as an uninvited guest on the lands of the Secwepemc Nation, and that I benefit from the intergenerational wealth of land ownership. I'm a squatter on these lands. The region was not negotiated by treaty and remains to this day unceded. Immediately around where I stay, this includes the people of the Splatcheen, Nisconlith, and Squilax bands. Kuksjam, or thank you. A Splatcheen band council member described the Secwepemc traditional lands to me as roughly defined by the Shuswap Lake watershed and occupied since time immemorial by the nation's diverse cultures. There is archaeological evidence of their presence dating back over 15,000 years. Ongoing, I'd like to also acknowledge and thank the ancestors and people of these bands for their ongoing inclusive activities towards healing and conciliation, and in the defense of the land, water, and creatures of this region. I also live and work in Igoli, or Johannesburg, South Africa, on the veld that is the traditional lands of the San and Soto Twana peoples. I learned in the course of my research that significant gold deposits were discovered in both these locations within 4 years of each other in the mid-1850s, triggering colonial mechanisms of land appropriation, displacement of communities thousands of years old, cultural assimilation, and imperial resource extraction. And I always like to just pause for a moment after that land acknowledgement to take it, to remind myself to take it in as and today we've been joined by two very special guests, and I've been really looking forward to this lecture. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Fahad Alotaibi and Dr. Sabeen bin Zayyad, and to learning more from them about a region that for many of us has been defined and or hijacked by narratives of extraordinary ancient civilizations, multiple layers of colonial redefining, fossil fuel extraction, and religious belief systems. Today, we will hear firsthand the perspectives from Fahad and Sabeen, and then have a discussion moderated by Canadian-based architect Veronica Madonna, who has worked on multiple projects in that region. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the names used for the Gulf region. Like in many post-colonial regions, such as our own here in Canada, or regions with shifting geopolitics, place names can become highly emotionally charged contentions, because with a loss of a name, a group can feel the erasure of their history. Since ancient times, the Gulf region has been known as the Persian Gulf, but with the pan-Arab movement of the mid-20th century, political pressures have shifted towards the use of the name Arabian Gulf. This has left many Iranians feeling just such a loss of their Persian history. Like in our own country, Canada, I wish the Gulf region healing and peace, inshallah. And with that, I will pass over to Veronica, who will give an in-depth introduction to our speakers, and then we'll begin with Fahad's talk.
Great, thank you, Kristen, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today at this Global Studio lecture. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Fahad Alotaibi and Dr. Sabeen bin Zayyad for this really important lecture. And one of the things that I think is critical in what they're doing and addressing through their lecture is considerations that many places around the world are actually faced with in the design of our cities today. And as we become more globally connected, the question that I often ask is, how do we approach design that maintains, celebrates, and respects local traditions, cultures, and society? And to me, this comes back to the importance of a holistic idea of sustainability, where it's critical to consider not only aspects of environmental, but the considerations of economic, social, and cultural perspectives of place. Dr. Fahad Alotaibi is an architect and educator. Fahad studied at King Saud University, where he received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture and and Building Science. He then received a Master's of Architectural Studies from the University of Sheffield. He has a PhD in Environmental Design and Architecture from the University of Calgary, Canada. Having previously worked in Riyadh municipality, as well as editor at Umran magazine and architectural researcher for King Saud University, Fahad recently joined the new College of Architecture and Planning at Qassim University and holds the head of architecture department position. He has been a reviewer and juror for many organizations, reviewer of King Salman Urban Charter, Ministry of Culture, Saudi Arabia, first design competition for Saudi architects jury member, Ministry of Housing, technical review for the Abdullatif Al Fowzan Award for Mosque Architecture, and Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, expert peer review. Fahad's research and teaching focuses on social and cultural processes that shape and form meanings of building environments, particularly in the Gulf region. His research is primarily in the areas of tall building design, human behavior and environmental psychology, culture, identity and placemaking, architecture, theory, and criticism. Welcome, Fahad. Our second speaker will be Dr. Sabeen bin Zayyad. Sabeen worked in the EPC and oil gas industry prior to going back to school to get her PhD in environmental design from the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape at the University of Calgary. With research focused on the Gulf region, Sabeen has published papers on the impact of architectural and urban developments on the cities of the Gulf and the notion of smart cities in the region. Her interdisciplinary research addresses the disconnect between context and the built environment, the incorporation of technologies in urban planning, and the conservation of heritage as a platform for social economic development. Welcome both Fahad and Sabeen. We greatly appreciate your time in preparing this lecture for us. Just a reminder to the audience that if there are any questions, please feel free to place them in the chat box. We'll have plenty of time to have an open discussion for questions and answers after the lectures. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Fahad.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you, Christine, Douglas. So thrilled to join you today in this Global Studio Lecture series. And I will start by trying to minimize the slides here. Yes, is the slides clear, Veronica, for you?
Yes, they look great. Thank you.
Okay. So in today's talk, I will explain the phenomena of the tall building in Gulf cities by critiquing these kind of megastructure projects through the lens of placemaking, urban integration, and sustainability. And the overarching aim of this research is to draw a big picture of the vertical development in the region by investigating in a depth 12 case studies. But due to the time limitation, I will focus on Riyadh cases today. The presentation agenda for today's talk will be the big question: why tall building in the Gulf? And then the short history of tall buildings. I will explore the case studies, like I said, in Riyadh city. And then looking through the interview results with the stakeholders. And at the end of the talk, I will propose the conceptual framework and design principles that works as a toolkit to improve this kind of building. We cannot ignore tall building, but we're trying to mitigate the negative consequences of building tall in the Gulf cities. In general, skyscrapers loom large in our urban cities and defining skylines and consuming blocks and shaping social fabric. They contain our businesses, incorporate our shopping malls, and increasingly including our homes. Cities around the world engage in consistently racing toward the sky. Whose building will be the tallest? And the Gulf cities are not the exception in this dilemma, because right now we have the tallest building in the world, and the future tallest building in the world also will be based in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And as a native Gulf citizen, as a Saudi, I'm always reflecting about the practice of tall buildings in the region. We need to consider to see the cultural aspect of these buildings. Tall buildings is an object that will usually change the skyline and changing the face of the city and helps to attract investing in the city. So it's a globalized icon that we need to reconsider very carefully when we talk about or designing tall buildings. Cesar Belli once said the skyscraper, by being much taller than the average construction, began to assume a public role, that of primary contributor to the solitude and the image of the city of which it was a part. So we have to go beyond the technicality of tall buildings and thinking about the cultural aspect and how to integrate these mega projects to our urban context. Love them or hate them, one thing we cannot do is ignoring them. A great quote by prominent scholar Chris Apple. And the growth of the tall buildings has increased dramatically, and especially in the last decade. According to the Council of Tall Building and Urban Habitat, 1/4 of the world's future tallest building project will be based within Middle East region, specifically Doha and Qatar, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi Arabia in general. And I will touch upon a brief history of tall building. Tall building is a new building typology that emerged in the late 19th century and evolved in the beginning of 20th century. There are three main innovations that helped to achieve this height of building a taller building, including the skeletal framework, which introduced by William LeBaron Jenney, and the innovating of elevator and the inventing of the electricity light. However, there's some changes in the building typology. According to Anthony Wood, the CEO of Council of Tall Building and Urban Habitat, three main shifts have been noticed in the last decade. The shift from North America to Asia and the Middle East regarding the location of the tallest building in the world, and the change on the material from steel to more composite or concrete one. And the last one, the changing from the use of tall building from office to more mixed use and fully residential one in Asia. And the importance of studying and critiquing tall building in Gulf stems from the need to address some environmental issues. The tall buildings usually a huge consumer of energy, and we need to rethink about the consequences and addressing the environmental issue of those buildings. Also, the insufficient integration of tall buildings into the urban realm and the lack of the master plan for tall building construction in the area. These three main issues is part of the general gaps I've noticed during my studies of these tall buildings. It's the placemaking, the urban integration, and especially the social sustainability of tall buildings in the region. The cases that have been studied in my PhD and in the last 2 years is 12 cases, three from each city. And this is show us the performance of these buildings based on the sustainability features, the identity features, the urban integration. And I will start with the first case studies, the Faisaliyya Tower, designed by Norman Foster and an iconic addition to the city skyline. According to the designer, the inspiration for this building was the minaret behind the building form. And the positive aspect of it, the climatic sensitive solution, or the way the architect neglected the fully glazed box and instead designed the tower with this transparent facade that were covered with the louvers. The other issue that has a negative impact of this building on the fabric in general is an apparent lack of urban integration with the urban context. There is no public spaces that help people to interact with these projects, especially the Faisaliyya Tower. The second case studies is Rafal Tower, and it is the second tallest building in Riyadh city behind the capital Authority Tower in Kaft in Riyadh. The fully glazed facade gives the tower, makes it more elegant contribution to the city skyline. However, here we see that the designer avoid the way to create more climatic sensitive building and used the fully glazed building. This will has a bad effect on the environment. The tower also use some kind of imitation the local language of architecture, the vernacular pattern of architecture in Najd architecture, and trying to copy it and paste it in a way to interact with the language and the culture of place. The third tower is the Aliyah Tower, twin towers located in one of the walkable promenade in Riyadh at Tahliya Street, designed by PD Abel Gaf with a consulting engineer Otaishan. The great aspect of this building is the huge plaza that placed in the intersection between Tahliya Street and the King Fahad or Al Street. This will work as a public space for people. However, the plaza like a green area, a water space, and playing area that would enhance and increase the use of the place. The building also use a modern language, increasing the transparency of the facade and avoiding any sustainable solution. In general, one of the methods I've used to looking through these issues is interview with the stakeholders. And I got a lot of great response and interesting ideas that help me to shape the conceptual framework at the end. The interviewee emphasized the fact that the history of tall building in the region is short, and we need to have a better design guidelines that help to achieve a meaningful building that meets the need of the people and reflect the culture and the meaning of the context. Also, they provide information about the lack of local expertise who would help to create more context or culturally driven solution for tall buildings. And I would like to read some interesting quote from the interview results. One of the developers said, unfortunately, all these ideas are great, but as a designer is restricted with the owner requirements and the budget. Some owner suspected that their property will be vulnerable for vandalism from the public, so they prefer to close their property. And this is in regard to the lack of public spaces around tall buildings. Another great quotes, like, we have a lost identity, we are just copying and pasting. If we want to improve identity issues in the city, there should be a consultant that negotiate each building and identify the main principles for the city identity. I think Abu Dhabi is a good example in the Gulf for how to deal with identity rather than the other Gulf cities. Try to summarize the whole issues here, like the issue of sustainability, the lack of social spaces, sky garden, vertical garden, some issue related to the urban integration, and the developer encouraging for creating more public realm for people, and also the impact of tall buildings on the microclimate level is a vital, needs more experts from firms to handle these issues. Also, tall building should be located in an operated zone area that has like an operate infrastructure and transportation capacities. It is also an issue related to the placemaking. One idea is that tall building presenting a new identity. So why do we need to adapt tall buildings as a modern icon to our culture or our vernacular architecture? Is there any reasonable thing behind that? Any regulation by authorities should consider by the views of both developers and architects, and by proposing the conceptual framework, I'm trying to creating a vehicle that could help us to achieve this goal. So the result from the interviews was a great method to help me to listen to the people, to listen to the stakeholders, and then proposing and design guidelines that will help us to achieve a meaningful tall buildings that achieve the sustainable goals and reflecting the culture of the place. So the importance of the conceptual framework is to help us to address complex issues that cannot be solved or fixed in isolation. For instance, the issue of placemaking. We are in an era of soulless architecture, of building development that has invaded the world in the era of globalization and the more placelessness, according to Edward Ralph, has shaped most of the world until reached the point where we would no longer see the uniquenesses of a place and end it with an end place. By encouraging the designer to look through the cultural meaning and the different aspect of a place, to also incorporating the user to participate in the early phases of the designing. And this is one of the things that we could propose, and at the end of the day we can make this conceptual framework work through a detailed design guidelines. So the forces that will help to create this conceptual framework is the local expertise, collective democratic process, and consultation, evaluation, and the building regulation. And we, like I mentioned, like in all of the Gulf cities, a specific building regulation for tall buildings. The design priority is work as a values for designing a tall building in the region. First design priority is about creating and encouraging mixed use and encouraging also strong sustainable ideas. Secondly, the essential or the green social spaces, and how to incorporate more social spaces and move beyond just the rating system of sustainable building, but looking through the real use of this building and how we can create a healthy and welcoming environment in a vertical spaces like tall building. The third design priority is about construction. tall building in an appropriate land that has capacity for handling huge demand for tall buildings, such as infrastructure, road capacity, and so on. Also, the fourth design priority about the tall building should be add to the urban realm by increasing public spaces on the site and increasing the accessibility and permeability through the site. The fifth design priority, and this stems from the comments raised by the interviewee. They said the tall building affect the views of the city from different angles. So the municipalities should looking through visual alternative scenarios and operate model scale showing the effect of the proposal on the site. And the last design priority is about the character of space and the identity of other building should be respected and considered. And we have to study the whole area, and any proposal should respect the urban and the context of this area. Place is a space overlaid with significance. Space is geometric while place is emotive, giving the extraordinary power and presence of the skyscrapers upon our land and within our cities. It is unquestionably imperative to elevate placemaking to an art. And this is one of the aim of these studies, is to go beyond the measured, the empirical, to more human-based architecture. And this is kind of the work I'm doing, and even the teaching philosophy I'm using with my student to encourage them to think about the user, to think about in a very holistic way how to achieve many goals rather than looking through the physical aspect of architecture. The main findings is few tall buildings in the Gulf cities embrace the idea of sustainability that helps to create tall buildings that have less adverse impact on environmental and generate clean energy through exploiting of renewable energy. In the Gulf region, there is a lack of appropriate tall building regulation and building laws that would mitigate the impact of tall building in the environment and help to better adapt this building to the context of the Gulf cities. Also, the urban integration between tall building and urban fabric is another issue that requires attention. This refers to continuity with the context, availability of public space, connection with public transportation, as well as coherence and respect for the character of the place. And the last one, the identity of place and the cultural aspect of the context need to be carefully considered by designers for tall buildings. Part of this research has been published in different international conferences and publications. And also, I encourage my students to participate on the student competition organized by Council of Tall Building and Urban Habitat. That's it, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Fahad, for the presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, I'll invite Sabeen to share her screen and present her lecture.
Sounds good. Give me a minute here.
And just a reminder to the audience, if there's any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat box and we'll address them after Sabeen's lecture.
I'm having a bit of difficulty, just bear with me here. All right, is everyone able to see that?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Just gonna blast it open. All right. Welcome everyone, and thank you all for attending this presentation. In full disclosure, Fahad and I went to PhD school together. And while he graduated 3 years ago, I just successfully defended my thesis 6 weeks ago. So this is my very first foray back into what I enjoy working on after this hiatus. While Fahad spoke to vertical urbanism, I will be discussing identity and its relation to vertical urbanism. In all honesty, I am not a fan of tall buildings, as beautiful as they may be, not to mention the allure they add to the skyline of a city. So when I was invited by Kristen to talk about the Gulf, I was told that since this was going to be a panel presentation, I could choose someone who would also be able to talk about the Gulf with me. And the first person that came to mind was Fahad. And I thought of no better partner to spar with than him. So I'm going to be playing devil's advocate to Fahad's fondness for tall buildings. So let us begin. I am going to be using Dubai as a focus of my part in this, as the focus for my part in this presentation, as it tends to be the flavor of the month, regardless of the weather, should I say. I will begin by giving you a quick introduction to the Emirate of Dubai, followed by a brief context on its urban developments. I will then talk about the ground consequences of vertical urbanism and concluding remarks. Many of you may have heard of Dubai, but perhaps do not know where exactly it is located. This slide shows two maps. The one to the left is a location of the United Arab Emirates located on the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. The Emirate of Dubai is one of 7 emirates that form the nation of the UAE. The map to the left is a map of Dubai depicting the built areas, including the Palm Jumeirah Island. This is one of the images of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai. Unfortunately, the photo is not dated, but it's pretty safe to say that he was very young when it was taken. I always like to start my writing and my presentations with a quote or an epigraph. So the one today is on excellence and challenges. There is some debate on whether the quote besides the picture can be attributed to Aristotle or not. Just to be safe, I've also written the word anonymous in case it wasn't Aristotle who said it. For those who are movie buffs like me, there's one other quote that was stated by Aristotle, and it was in the movie Legally Blonde, when Reese Witherspoon, playing the character of Elle, is in class, and the prof asks, "Who said the following quote? The law is reason free from passion." And another student answered, "Aristotle." But I digress. The quote is meaningful and is reflective of Sheikh Mohammed's dreams, ambitions, and vision for Dubai. I also think it is a fitting one for the way that the urbanization of the Gulf countries have taken place and continue to take place, especially the last part of the quote, to see obstacles as opportunities. Based on interviews with Sheikh Mohammed by journalists, Dubai has sought to view these challenges, if you'd like to call it, as opportunities, and segues well into our presentation on vertical urbanism and identity. About Dubai. Many of you know Dubai as a rich city-state, that it is always in the news due to its various feats, such as building the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, as an island shaped like a palm tree, as the largest mall in the world known as the Dubai Mall, and where the Mall of the Emirates has an indoor ski slope. More recently, it is home to the highest infinity pool in the world that just opened up in November of last year. Not to mention that Dubai also has the world's tallest Ferris wheel that also opened in October of last year. But many don't know of Dubai's history, that over 4/5 of Dubai's land is desert, that it was beset by poverty until oil was discovered in 1966, of the struggles it has faced to be where it is today, of its people. And I'm talking about the citizens of Dubai, or Emiratis as they are known, who are a minority in their own nation and who currently form only 8.6% of Dubai's population based on 2020 statistics. Dubai's urban stories. To better understand the discourse on Dubai's urban identity, a brief contextual background on its urban development is important in order to understand how and why Dubai is where it is today. Beginning with the arrival of the Al Maktoums to Dubai from Abu Dhabi in 1833, and preceded by the arrival of the British in the 18th century, Dubai's rulers ensured that Dubai's economy could be built by creating an environment where commercial trading could thrive unencumbered and make Dubai the most important commercial entrepot in the region. Another key element that played a role in Dubai's urban developments were the tribal affiliations and merchants in the economic process, and thus its eventual urbanization. Excuse me. Dubai's urban development began to take shape when the British influenced how Dubai's first master plan was going to take place and was created by John Harris. For those of you interested in this contextual approach to how Dubai's urban developments took shape, I'm going to refer you to my thesis, which is currently under embargo and should be available after February. The discovery of oil in 1966 was another important factor in how Dubai's urbanization took place vis-a-vis the development of its infrastructure. With the withdrawal of the British in 1971, Dubai's urban development began to take place at a faster pace. Today, Dubai's urban trajectory is at full throttle speed, as Sheikh Mohammed once described it. The next bullet point on the integration of Dubai's vertical developments with its urban fabric is an interesting one for a number of reasons. First, it must be remembered that the economy of Dubai from the time of the arrival of the Al Maktoums was based on attracting commercial traders from other regions in the Gulf, other areas in the Gulf, due to its liberal trading policies. But it was also a regional hub for the import and export of goods prior to the discovery of oil, and continues to be so. Oil was just an additional factor that propelled the rapid trajectory of Dubai's urbanization process. As Sheikh Rashid bin Zayyad Al Maktoum, the current ruler of Dubai's father, once said, "I would like to assure you that the appearance or non-appearance of petroleum does not much interest us. We are merchants, and all this progress that you see came from trade and not from petroleum." Based on my research while studying for my PhD, it was not simply the factors of globalization and identity that shaped Dubai's urban development or vertical urbanism, but the notion of change was also an emergent theme. While Fahad spoke to how vertical urbanism could be seen in a more positive light, I beg to differ. The people that connect these buildings, that give meaning to these buildings, are just as equally important. These changes are reflected in the disconnect that the residents of Dubai have with their built environment, its rapid pace of transformation, and the creation of spatial, economic, and social boundaries. So what are the ground consequences of vertical urbanism? First is social sustainability, humanizing the isolation felt by many residents reflected in the spaces that they try and connect with. It's important to understand that. Spaces that are created with economic and social boundaries. Muslims believe the aesthetics of the environment that is built and the depth and breadth of the social interactions that take place within this environment resonate on their spiritual lives. In reciprocity, the ethos of the Islamic faith is reflected in the environment that is created and the connections that are made, giving the aspect of social sustainability within the Islamic world great importance. The second outcome, or the second grand consequence, is the balancing of vernacular designs with Western-inspired ones. The changes that take place are not always reflected in the structures being created. In his article on Architecture of Pluralism, Begday stated that the ethics and values that guide society are being overshadowed by the culture of economics and consumerism. Respecting and balancing past traditions and future developments become an important aspect of how architectural designs and urban planning processes take place. The third grand consequence is revitalization process. This brings us to the next point. How are heritage narratives constructed vis-a-vis the culture of economics? The revitalization projects that Dubai has undertaken over the past few years have come under quite a bit of criticism. Many argue that these developments are misplaced. Misplaced in the sense that they are geared toward tourism and do not subscribe to the idea that the revitalization process also needs to embrace and include its historic and environmental characteristics, but also the involvement of its occupants. Modernizing these sites is just not enough. The fourth grand consequence is identity. How do the residents of these Gulf cities interpret their relationship with their built environment? There is more of an emphasis on form than on function, likely contributing to very little or no interaction between the residents and their environment, as well as among the residents. The notions of transience and belonging are also topics that dominate quite a bit of the literature on the expression of identity through the built environment. In conclusion, what does the above all mean for vertical urbanism and identity in these Gulf cities? Changing urban identity, displacement of its residents, and disconnectedness between the vertical urbanism and the residents are some of the challenges associated with modern urbanization and development. Like any other city, one might say, but Gulf cities are different from other cities. They're kingdoms based on tribal relationships. They are unique in their demography, where the expatriates outnumber the citizens by anywhere from 70% to over 90%, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and Oman, where their citizens form approximately 63% of the population, based on the government of Saudi Arabia's 2016 statistics, and 72% for the Sultanate of Oman for 2021. In addition to the demographic, there is noticeable segregation and exclusivity based on socioeconomic disparities and constant struggles to balance the modern with the traditional. In his speech at the Architectural League of New York 2017 President's Medal Award ceremony, Homi Bhabha spoke of how, and I quote, "Pluralistic inquiry was a living link between society and public space," unquote, and that the discipline of architecture reflected this connection. Concepts of pluralism and tolerance are becoming more visible when the Gulf cities are asked about their design and planning processes. Although the pace of change has been too fast for a number of Dubai's residents, the vertical mega projects taking place have also led to other concerns surrounding the viability and sustainability of these developments, which have an impact on the existing urban fabric. In essence, the lack of affinity and sense of community as perceived by the residents of the Gulf cities has also affected their identity, well, at least for Dubai. So my concluding question to Fahad and our moderator, or questions to Fahad and our moderator, Veronica, would be, do these ground consequences speak to the deficiencies in how Gulf cities are planned vis-a-vis vertical urbanism? And can traditional perspectives be reconciled with modern developments? Thank you.
Thank you, Sabeen, for that lecture, and thank you, Fahad, again. Both very interesting and inspiring lectures. And thank you, Sabeen, for posing those questions, which we'll get to in just a minute. What I thought was very interesting that you both spoke about was the underlying concern about this cultural integrity and maintaining it and developing it within this modern world. I think these are issues that many places around the world are faced with today as we kind of approach globalization and the kind of increased and acceleration of globalization in cities today. You know, one of the aspects that you spoke about, Sabeen, was this idea of conservation. And I think many of us, when we think of conservation, we think of simply a preserving of the past, but you know, one of the important aspects is this celebrating of heritage value in the face of change to address the needs of current society. So just back to your question, Sabeen, which I'd like to open it up to Fahad and yourself and to participate in, is can traditional perspectives be reconciled with modern developments? And so I'd love to just open that up and start a conversation with that. We also have a couple of questions in the chat box, which I'll get to in a moment, but maybe I'll pass it to Fahad to maybe respond to that first.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Sabeen. Yeah, like I said, the rapid transformation of the Gulf cities in just like 35 years, we moved from cities that has no one or single high-rise building to the cities that having the tallest building in the world. So these rapid transformation affects many things, and we need to take time and to even improving our local architecture firms to practice this kind of building. So like as I mentioned, the lack of local expertise. One of the prominent architects in Qatar once said to me, he neglected or he regretted the building he designed by using traditional motif at the base of the building. So he said, I'm just trying to decorate the modern building to make it look related to our environment and our culture. And I believe there are a lot of great examples for interpreting the culture of the place, such as the Doha Tower by Jean Nouvel. We're trying to reinterpreting the Mashrabiya and use it as a sun screen that create a very sensitive building to culture and the environment. Even before that, we have here in Saudi Arabia, Al-Ahli Bank Tower, designed by SOM, and the using of the urban principles like the courtyard and trying to incorporate this idea for a vertical building is another great example. And I believe it's one of the tallest building in the region that gained the Aga Khan Award. So yeah, there's a lot of great example for integrating this issue of cultural and climatical approaches. But the majority is the fully glazed boxes that we need as an educator and architect to raising the awareness of people about this building and trying to. One of the goals of my research is to provide design guidelines for the cities and municipalities to try to mitigate the impact, the negative impact of these buildings.
Great, thank you, Fahad. Sabeen, did you want to address that as well?
Fahad knows I'm always going to disagree with him, but just out of curiosity, earlier Fahad mentioned that Abu Dhabi has a good concept on how to address identity more so than other Gulf cities. And I'm curious to know what was the reason behind it? But you know, can you address that in terms of context? Like, why is Abu Dhabi? Not that I'm against Abu Dhabi, but I'm curious to know why you chose Abu Dhabi as the city.
The result of the interviews with the stakeholders. So this is the quote from another guy, but I can see the reason behind that. Abu Dhabi, one of the cities that's not imitating the approach of Dubai, vertical urbanism, with the less tall buildings and more modest building, with creating more urban realm in the city planning in general. So I think this is the reason he mentioned Abu Dhabi rather than Dubai or Doha or Kuwait.
Thank you.
I think there's an interesting conversation that was mentioned in terms of the role that local architects have in the development of placemaking. You know, it's something that we see also here in Canada, where many of our important and significant buildings that are going out to, you know, in search of an architect or planner are opened up internationally, and it's a lot of it is the race to see, you know, which international architect that we can lure to the country. Where it lacks short is celebrating the local architects and architecture and that we have here. And so I think, you know, the idea of the role of local architects and local community plays an important part in not only, being able to facilitate aspects of building code, but also more critically, cultural and sustainable and environmental significance of a certain place that can really start to shape identity even more so. So I think this aspect of engaging local community and designers is really important in part of that design priorities that you had set up, Fahad. Maybe just moving to a question.
Sorry, Veronica, could I intercede here? We're talking
Absolutely.
about the different stakeholders, and you talked about the architects, but what about the residents themselves? How do we make this a more inclusive process?
Yeah.
Is it possible to make this a more inclusive process? Now, remember, the demographic is unique for Dubai, as I mentioned earlier. So how would this be addressed? And then I'm curious to know about that.
Sure. Fahad, do you have some ideas on that?
Yes, like I proposed in the conceptual framework, I said the democratic collective role of the public in the way of public hearing in a major projects, encouraging the municipality to hear from the people and the resident. And actually, recently, the mayor of Riyadh, Prince Faisal bin Zayyad, was asking people about their opinions and about the city in general, and is there any initiatives they hope to see in Riyadh city. And he just collecting the ideas from his social account. And this is a great way to listen to the people and then to address the issue they raise or brought up on the surface.
Yeah, and
Thank you,
maybe
Fahad.
just from my perspective as well, I think that, when we approach projects or any new developments or considerations for design or planning, it's critical that we place more importance on that community engagement process to help define the parameters way before we even perhaps define a project. I think there has to be more ability for the community to provide insightful comments throughout the process. We see that happening in the middle of the process right now, thinking about, Canadian approaches to design. And I think that has to come up straight up front to the beginning to help shape projects, to help inform projects, and then execute them through. But perhaps we can turn to a question from the audience. And so the first question we have here is, thank you, Dr. Fahad, for the informative presentation. Saudi Arabia is developing sustainable mega projects like the Red Sea and the Lion City in Neom. Do you see tall buildings as part of these project development plans?
Not in Neom or the Lion City. I see the officials focuses more on the issue of sustainability and high density rather than tall buildings. So they avoid the image of tall buildings and focusing more on the social aspect of the urbanism. But in Riyadh city, Riyadh is moving towards more population, increasing the population in the city based on the goals of the commission, Royal Commission of Riyadh City. So we can see more high density in Riyadh and an increase of tall buildings in Riyadh City.
Great, thank you. The next question actually is for Sabeen. So thank you, Dr. bin Zayyad, for the excellent presentation. I wanted to ask, what role do the tribal affiliations play in Dubai's urban fabric today?
Okay, I would have liked to ask the participant for a bit more clarification on this, but I will attempt to answer the best I can based on the question the participants posed. So the tribal affiliations, the UAE is a tribal based nation, as I had mentioned earlier, and the tribes play an important role in the political system of the country. specifically regarding Dubai and its urban fabric today, like any other resident, their input is also very important. Whether they are heard or they're not heard, I'm not aware of this. However, the role they play is important in the sense that they have a voice to go out and speak and say, this is not in agreement with the way we view or vision our community. Now, the question is very tight in that space, but what I'm going to speak to a little bit about more is community and community development in the UAE. So the notion of communities in the UAE, or specifically in Dubai, is very limited, almost non-existent. Majority of the population of Dubai are expatriates, so they live where they find is more suitable to their lifestyle, depending on their location of work, their commute, their kids' school. And for those who can't, who tend to stay, who are able to stay in villas like the Emiratis, or even in apartments. Now, mind you, not all Emiratis tend to live in villas. Their community is slowly being relegated to the boundaries of Dubai. And the reason behind that is because there's a strong, inherent, innate need to preserve their culture, their traditions, their society. And it's not, everybody thinks they're being aloof, but they're not being aloof. This is something that they are choosing to do. So the government is listening to them and chooses to place them on the boundaries of Dubai, where the way they live their lifestyle, the way they conduct their lives, their culture, their traditions, their faith, the practice of the faith is kept intact. So partially answering the question, what role? Remember, not all Emiratis are tribal based either, even though the political system is tribal based. Not all Emiratis are from tribes. So there's a mixture. I think more than seeing whether they're from a tribe or from just being Emiratis, I think we need to look at this more from an Emirati perspective and saying, what role do the Emiratis play in Dubai's urban fabric today? And they do play, I'm not going to measure the role, but they do make their thoughts known via the majlises that are being held by the ruler, where they're free to voice their opinions, their concerns about how, and one of the outcomes is the creation of communities or the creation of little areas for the Emiratis on the outskirts, or not even on the outskirts, on the outside of the main area developments of Dubai. I hope that answers the participant's question.
Thank you, Sabeen. You know, it starts to raise some questions too, and maybe this can be posed to Fahad as well in terms of the landscape in Riyadh and the communities and the impact of communities in Riyadh. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that, Fahad?
In regard to the communities, you mean?
Yes, perhaps how do the kind of integration of tall buildings impact the communities? As one of your design priorities, you had mentioned about, you know, being very considerate about the location of the buildings and the clustering of the buildings. I'm just wondering, what's the current perhaps landscape of Riyadh, and is there any impact on communities right now?
Usually, in the Gulf in general, we consider the tall buildings and an isolated environment, because it's in a places that will prevent the lower class from reaching these areas, because it's in a very expensive areas, and this is related to the kind of neoliberalism and this kind of accommodation of architecture, and part of the reason behind the tall buildings is a money making. It's a money making machine that helps developers to generate more profit. So it's located usually in upper spaces, places that has a less inclusive area for or lower class, if I can say.
Thank you, Fahad. And, there's a question in the chat box that perhaps is related to this. It asks, how are tall buildings functional for the local inhabitants, and how do they relate these buildings to their culture? As you clearly pointed out that the skyscrapers are in emulation of the Western world.
We're still struggling to create a local typology of tall buildings. And I'm with the opinion or the side that's looking through this as a modern project and trying just to thinking through the lens of critical regionalism by focusing on the climate and topography and all these kind of principles that help to achieve the identity, not trying to copy from the past, but creating tall buildings that reflect our modern time. And related to the local, usually this kind of tall buildings is more used as office buildings still in Riyadh. And majority of these tall buildings is used as office buildings rather than residential. So this is also relate to the culture of people. People used to or like to live in low-rise building rather than tall buildings. So I see the next move in Riyadh urbanism is more vertical urbanism, medium rise rather than tall buildings, and this will create a lot of opportunities for architects dealing with the issue I mentioned in the presentation today.
Perhaps just steering away here a little bit, starts to remind me of, I'm located here in Toronto, Canada. One of the things that we're seeing here is this kind of influx of taller buildings, of course, not to the same extent of Dubai and Riyadh. But one of the things that I can't help notice is that there's this lack of materialism that really starts to devoid the buildings of any sense of place. Building here could be placed anywhere. And there's this lack of connection to the local community, the local material sourcing. And so just out of curiosity, what are your feelings in terms of how material and form could influence this aspect of encouraging greater cultural and social importance and identity?
I would prefer more creative architecture rather than copying from the past and using traditional motifs and just putting on the surface of tall buildings. And we witnessed these examples even in Riyadh in these days. We have like the tallest traditional buildings, and it just the designer imitating the pattern from vernacular architecture. So this is not the way we can handle the issue of identity and placemaking. Like I mentioned, the Al-Ahli Tower in Jeddah is a great example by creating a vertical garden and providing a pleasant space for the office users. This is a great example for how to reinterpret traditional elements and then bring it to our modern time and evolve it until we see it as a tall building idea. And this is also an issue of tall buildings. Tall building, usually they said two things that refer to globalization is the tall buildings and the car. These two things that change the whole world and make all the things in the same way. So we cannot ignore the placelessness aspect of tall buildings, but we're trying to adapt it to our culture.
I'd like to add to that. So in Dubai, for example, the decline of traditional structures has led to a decline in the sense of locality. So it can be said that Dubai's architectural developments are sort of a product of its circumstances when it began to gain a commercial presence since the early 20th century. And that's only part of the narrative. There is that desire to maintain its links to its history, so sort of to give meaning to their buildings, but that's not always a successful thing. Earlier on, Fahad mentioned the Mashrabiya. The Mashrabiya is not native to the Gulf. It comes from outside of the Gulf region. So when things like the wind tower begin to be imported into the Gulf architecture or the Mashrabiya, one needs to question, where is this the sense of continuity? Is this the sense of link being maintained to the culture, or is there more emphasis on representation than meaning? So these narratives are not always consistent. So as much as we would like to say that there's tall buildings can be used for mixed use purposes. They can have green social spaces that can work in harmony with the other buildings. At the end of the day, I still stand by my point that it's the people that give meaning to these buildings. And so when you take the Burj Khalifa, for example, one has to ask how many locals, as the Emiratis are called, how many locals interact with those buildings? How many expatriates of middle class can actually connect with the building, identify with the building, make use of the building? Not very many. And the Burj Khalifa is a classic example of exclusionary spaces. So where is the placemaking taking place? It becomes exclusive. The space becomes very, the space becomes segregated, and boundaries are created. So when you have all these number of tall buildings, how do you make them integrate with the rest of the environment around you, the landscape, the people? How do you connect that? And I think that's a very important question to keep in mind every time we design a tall building.
I think those are great principles to think about with any building. The idea of placemaking and integration is really important at any scale, right down to, a small home. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. This one is for Sabeen. How do you see the Centennial Project's UAE 2071 affecting the heritage and the culture of the UAE?
Okay, so one has to remember that the Centennial Project is basically a blueprint for the future generations of the country. Specifically, and this is the way I interpret it, is specifically for the Emiratis. So if you look at the objectives of the Centennial period, it's more based on, and I'm going to just read this off, is more based on future-focused government, excellent education, a diversified knowledge economy. Knowledge economy is a big thing in the Gulf right now, and a happy and cohesive society. But what that also includes is, cementing the country's reputation, cementing its reputation as a center for export and import, investing in education by the incorporation of technologies, building and reinforcing Emirati values for future generations, increasing productivity. So as far as the heritage and the culture of the UAE goes, that is very high in the overall grand scheme. It's not specifically mentioned in the Centennial Goals, but given the different pillars that I outlined recently, I just outlined, it forms a huge part of it, because again, it is the government's interest to maintain that Emirati identity. They're a very small, tiny population. To have them overwhelmed is not going to be conducive to the future of the country. So they need to mention, they need to maintain that, and that needs to be clearly emphasized, which they have done. Now, many people don't like that. They say, well, there's expatriates living in the country. What about us? But as Jirash said in one of his YouTube videos in the panel presentation, presence of the expatriates is a transactional relationship and nothing more. So the future of the country, if it is focusing on the Emiratis, rightly is doing so rightly. I hope that answers your question.
That was great, thank you. This is a question from Kristen to the both of you. Thank you for this fascinating window into design and identity of this region. I'd like to ask the both of you, in many post-colonial regions and countries around the world, we are seeing a shift away from designing and evaluating the built environment through a Eurocentric lens to one based on local philosophies, cultures, and climates. Do you think this kind of shift in the Gulf region, so what do you think of this kind of shift in the Gulf region? I'll open it up to the both of you to share your thoughts on that.
Feel free to go first.
Thank you, Sabeen.
He did his
Yes,
PhD first, so.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I see this local philosophies and cultural, and I benefited a lot from a great scholar in the region, Professor Yasser Shishtawi from Columbia University, even Professor Ali Abdul Rauf, he was with us tonight, and Professor Mishari Naim. All of those prominent scholars have exploring a lot of issues of identity and placemaking and the urbanism in the Gulf region. And I see the new generation also of the scholars in the Gulf region also embracing a new approaches for tackling these issues. So yeah. Go ahead, Sabeen.
So just to build on what Fahad said, yes, there is a shift in the Gulf region. There is, as new generations of Emiratis get educated abroad in the West and within their own country, there is that desire to incorporate more of local values into the structures that are being created, in the way designs are created in their nation, and rightly so. I mean, I don't think they're against tall buildings, but as one Emirati participant told me, they said that it was even if I never really considered these buildings as part of my identity, all of a sudden that was how people saw Dubai. It was through these modern buildings. So I guess it contributed to their sense of identity. But I think there is a conscious shift of the Emiratis to say, you know what, we're going to now take control of how the planning of our cities takes place. And you know what, the best part about this, considering that the Gulf region is very conservative in nature, the Khalijis in general are conservative people. They are. The ruler of Dubai, for example, is so open to pushing his citizens, especially women, in positions of leadership, and to encourage them to go forward and to study. So you see this mindset now beginning to change from the time of, my mother-in-law's generation to now, where it's like, no, we want to do this. We need to incorporate more of our local values and reinforce our identity through the structure of these buildings, even though they previously weren't, but now they are, or they're beginning to be so. So it's nice to see that shift away from that colonial mentality, but that's not to say that the colonial mentality was done as an insult to the local people. We have to remember the education system did not exist at that time. So when the British were in the UAE, they were also interested in seeing Dubai develop, of course, for their own purposes. They had their intentions to build their economy back home as well. And so they pushed for that development, realizing that that was the only way Dubai, for example, was going to develop. And when the oil came in, it just took off, and it's still taking off right now. So yeah, it's good to see that.
And I think this is a really important question, and you know, can be placed in any part of the world in this idea of how do we, you know, move away from, you know, one lens and designing through one lens. And this idea of local tradition and value, I think is really important. The idea of placemaking that you both spoke about, as well as the importance of the engagement of the local community. I think those are all really important aspects that need to make more of a presence in the design process as we move forward into this kind of next generation of buildings in the built environment. I'm going to move to another question from the audience, and this is for Fahad. Is there a necessity to have tall buildings, buildings that the locals may not be able to relate to? Besides using these buildings for offices, what are the reasons for such architecture?
Okay. The short answer is no. There is no necessity from my point of view, but it's a reality, and we need to adapt to these kind of buildings. Like I said, it's a profit making, and the developers will try to make a lot of skyscrapers. Our aim is to trying to mitigate these kind of tall buildings to meet the needs. That's it.
I think that's a really important point, though. Is there a need? Well, you know, we can say that about a lot of different buildings, but it's a reality. So the question is how do we address that? How do we approach the design? I think your design priorities start to set up a really important level of conversation as to, you know, how do we address this idea? You know, many cities around the world are talking about densification, and how do we address densification? Going in them with a very strong set of design priorities, I think, is something many places around the world needs to consider. But just maybe stepping back, Sabeen, there was the question earlier that was raised regarding the tribal affiliations. There's just a kind of follow-up response. From the audience who had asked the question. So earlier you said the tribal affiliations was a reason for Dubai's urban development in the past, part of the context. So I wanted to know if they still remain prevalent today. So Sabeen, is there any follow-up that perhaps you could give on that question?
As I earlier mentioned, rather than seeing the tribes are an important part of Dubai, but rather than seeing and kind of dissecting the Emirati population between tribal and non-tribal, I think it's better to look at it from an overall Emirati perspective and say, you know, do they play a role in the development of their country? And yes, they do. Through majlises, through putting their requests into the government, to expressing their discontent at having to move, or, you know, that loss of their urban fabric, their social fabric. You know, they were growing up in these neighborhoods when Dubai first started creating all these places and building homes for the locals. And there was this sense of, okay, one or two generations growing up together, they knew each other's neighbors. But now you have new developments taking place in Dubai's inner city and encroaching on these areas. And the Emiratis don't feel comfortable with what they're seeing right now. And I base that on my interviews, my research with the participants. And so they are not averse to moving a little bit outside of where the main most of the population resides, just so that they have that privacy. Privacy is an important aspect of not just collegiate culture, but the entire Islamic world, of Muslims in general. So having that privacy to be able to practice your faith, practice your culture, come and go as you please, is very important to them. So yeah, is it still taking place? Yes, it is still taking place as their developments are created by the government. And was that the question, or there was more to the question?
No, I think that was great. It was a follow-up to
Okay.
an earlier question. But we're coming close to the end of our time, and maybe I'll kind of ask this final question that's in our chat box here to the both of you. And that, do you think the people should be aware how to create their identity, or should it come naturally with the development of the community? That's a really interesting question. I'll pass it over to the both of you to share your thoughts.
Okay, so buildings, I don't think tall buildings have an identity of their own. It's people who make the identities, who create the identities of the building. Should the people be aware of how to create their identity? I think that we need to go back to the question of the notion of identity. What is identity? How does one define identity? And there's so many definitions of identity. And so we need to keep that in the back of our mind. And does identity, or should it come naturally with the development of the community? Of course, it's part and parcel of how one defines themselves as an identity. I had this Twitter exchange with, when I had my Twitter account for school purposes, with a gentleman. And I had to conclude by saying, you know what, your identity or home is not where your identity belongs. It could, maybe there is global identity. There is identity belonging to a specific country. It depends on how you look. When the community is developing, if you are part of that community, your identity naturally develops in your interactions and your experiences with the people. So I think it's not just having an awareness of how identity is created. I think it's just part and parcel of human psyche that comes naturally when we live with other people rather than in isolation. And then speaking of isolation, is one of my ground consequences. I did say, you know what, we need to humanize that isolation. Living in a tall building, just having your conversations with your laundryman or your gym trainer all in the same building doesn't really provide for much. I mean, it's nice to say it's the mixed use building, but then there's a bigger world outside. That is also part and parcel of the identity. And you need to step outside of that to connect with other people to build a more robust identity. And I think that's very important.
So this idea of, people-centric communities is perhaps what I'm hearing here.
Yeah, just like we have car-centric cities, and there's a strong dislike and aversion to that. We need to also, I'm not saying create an aversion or build an aversion to, human-centric or identity, human-centric buildings, but keep using the same car-centric model in mind. You need to make a little bit less of build a little less of the roads and build a little more of the walking space. And in staying in buildings, you need to stay a little bit less in these tall buildings where everything is available to you in one building, because you forget there's a world outside, and start learning to say, maybe we need to, not make mixed uses building. Maybe we need to limit the number of uses the building can have, so that people can go outside of this perspective and connect with other buildings, with other people, with other physical spaces. And that's how spaces are also created. That's how placemaking also takes place. It's not limited to just one small square footage of the area.
That's interesting. Fahad, did you want to respond to any of that or add to that?
Sabeen, Veronica. Yeah, I think the authentic identity of place come from the interaction between the people and the spaces. As a designer, we should have this kind of space for people to impact the building by incorporating them in the design process and hearing from them, and also making an action setting. I mean, the things that help people to make the place attachment, to attach to the place, to create this bonding with places. So like as mentioned in the talk, it's not just about the physicality of this building, but also the human dimensions and how we create the human-centered architecture that satisfy the needs of people, reflect their culture, So the identity issue is not a very easy task to handle in all sorts of buildings, but we're trying to looking through it and examining the identity issue in tall building, and it's a very challenging topic. I mean, identity by definition is a globalized icon, like I said, and modern building technology that emerged from the Industrial Revolution and the consequences of this innovation. And then right now we're trying to create a local model of tall buildings. So it's not like I said, it's not an easy task or the answer for this question is 1 million. It's very, very hard to handle it.
But just to add to that, so basically, you know, like we look at identity as a set of established characteristics, you know, that sort of gives someone their recognition as a person. Now, when you try and put that within the Emirate of Dubai, given its unique demography, it becomes a little difficult because everybody looks at their identity in a different space. Some look at them, okay, we're Emiratis and we're expatriates. Within the expatriates, they come from a number of different countries. So then when these people go out and try and make meaning or create meaning with the spaces they occupy and turn them into places, it becomes a little bit more, again, exclusive. And I believe Yasser al-Shishtawi addressed this in one of his books, is where you have an area like Nasser Square, where you have all these little groups congregating based on their community linkages or their ethnic-based identities. And so, again, it's more a more comfortable feeling for them to create those places for them rather than to. So is that identity bad? No. It just becomes more it just becomes more complex to address this within that particular context of Dubai.
Yeah. Well, we're just over time, but I think we can't have a lecture today without talking about the pandemic. And this is a question from Kristen, and perhaps this will be our final question. So I'm going to pose this to the both of you. The pandemic has made many cities around the world reevaluate the push for densification. Are you seeing this issue challenge any of the previous design and urban planning trajectories?
For sure, yes. Yes, I see the consequences of the pandemic will change a lot of the urban environment, even the education system, how to teach about designing more resilient environment and healthy environment. In regard to the tall buildings, we see that lots of companies shut down during the pandemic and people working remotely. But I don't see this at the end of the skyscraper and office building, but it will make those spaces more flexible so people can work from anywhere. Maybe we can see the use of artificial intelligence to help control this environment in the future.
That's really interesting. I think this is a conversation that many places around the world are facing. What do we do with you know, the nature of how we're living and working these days? Sabeen, did you want to add to that at all?
Just to say that, yeah, it's a big challenge, I would say. I mean, tall buildings are dense, you know. So how do you address that when you're in close proximity, and with the pandemic and the spread of the virus? How do you address that? Do you isolate yourself even more, you know, or do you come up with alternative solutions? And to be honest with you, I haven't seen any that has been put forth by Dubai, so I can't speak to that. And in all honesty, I haven't done any research on that either. But it's just a logical consequence, a thought consequence, is that with all this denseness, how do you address that in the way of pandemic? It's not enough to say or sequester yourself and say, hey, I'm at home, I have a home office, and I'm all self-contained. Because here, even in Canada, even though we have our homes and we're self-contained and we have homes, our working spaces, whether it be on a dining table or a room, people still feel that they're isolated. We're social butterflies. Humans are social butterflies. And so you can't keep us isolated. So how does vertical urbanism address that challenge is a big question, as Fahad pointed out as well. So.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank you both, Fahad and Sabeen, for a really insightful lecture today and for all your time. I apologize if we missed any questions, but I think we're slightly over our time here together. I'll just maybe kind of go round table if there's any final comments or questions as from either Fahad, Sabeen, Kristen, or Douglas before we kind of conclude today.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, do reach out to the organizers, and I'll make sure that I can try and answer them.
And Veronica, I'd just like to thank our two speakers, but also make sure that everybody knows that they're invited to the event on Thursday to talk about the future of the Global Studio. But thank you to you and to Kristen and to our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Douglas. I'd like to thank you, Douglas, Veronica, Christine, for inviting me, and Sabeen for this great conversation tonight. I really enjoyed the debate and the lecture, and I would like also to thank the attendees here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd also just like to thank everyone for attending, and as part of my role in the Global Studio, I have the great privilege of meeting people from around the world. And I just wanted to thank Fahad and Sabeen and say what an absolute pleasure it's been working with both of you. And so hopefully we'll work together again in the future. And thank you, Veronica, for such a well-informed moderation of the conversation. That was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was such an insightful morning, and thank you both, Fahad, Sabeen. I've learned so much myself, and I appreciate all the time we've spent together preparing for today. So I hope we can carry on the conversations afterwards.
I hope so too. I enjoyed it very much. It was a great experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
And thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.